The drive to the campsite was long, even by American standards. The forests of Maine stretched out either side of the road, a wall of green that swallowed the sunlight. We were supposed to be having a family adventure, escaping the city for a few precious days of wilderness. My wife, Sarah, had planned the whole thing, bless her. I just drove. We finally arrived, hours later. The campsite was mostly empty, just a couple of RVs parked far off in the distance. Perfect, I thought, peace and quiet. We set about pitching the tent, a family-sized monstrosity that always seemed to take an unreasonable amount of time to assemble. Our two kids, 8-year-old Tom and 5-year-old Emily, ran off to explore, their shouts echoing in the quiet woods. Later that afternoon, Tom came running back, face flushed with excitement. He tugged at my sleeve, babbling about something he'd found deep in the trees. I sighed, but Sarah gave me a look, so I relented and followed him. We walked for what felt like ages, pushing through ferns and ducking under low-hanging branches. Eventually we came to a small clearing. In the center was a mound of earth, barely noticeable beneath a carpet of fallen leaves. What caught my eye was the cross. It was old, probably homemade. The wood grey and worn. It was angled precariously, like it was about to topple over, stuck into the center of the mound. I didn't like it, not one bit. I told Tom to leave it alone, and we headed back to camp. I didn't mention it to Sarah, not wanting to ruin the mood. We cooked hot dogs on the small portable grill, the smell of burning sausages mixing with the scent of pine needles. The kids were tired from their exploring and fell asleep quickly in the tent. Sarah and I stayed up a little longer, sharing a beer and enjoying the stillness. I went to sleep feeling content, but something felt not quite right. I couldn't put my finger on it. It was just a feeling, a prickle on the back of my neck. I woke sometime in the night. Everything was quiet, unnervingly so. There were no crickets chirping, no rustling in the undergrowth, just silence. I shifted in my sleeping bag, trying to get back to sleep, but then something. It was a scraping sound, coming from outside the tent, like something was being dragged across the ground. My heart started to race. I nudged Sarah awake, but she just mumbled something and rolled over. The scraping continued, circling the tent. It was getting harder to breathe. I wanted to grab a torch or a knife, anything, but I was frozen with fear. The sound went on and on. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. I lay there, rigid, waiting, listening. Nothing. After what felt like an eternity, I drifted back to sleep. I woke up to sunlight streaming into the tent. Sarah was already up, rummaging through the camping gear. "Where's Emily?" she asked, her voice laced with panic. My blood ran cold. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag and looked around. Emily's sleeping bag was empty. Her small backpack was still there, untouched. We searched the tent, frantically pulling things aside, but she was gone. Sarah started screaming. I tried to stay calm, telling her she couldn't have gone far, that she must have just wandered off while we were still asleep. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. We searched the immediate area around the campsite, calling her name. There was no sign of her. Finally, I decided to go back to the clearing where Tom and I had been the day before. Maybe she had gone back there, drawn by the cross. I ran through the woods, my breath coming in ragged gasps. When I reached the clearing, my stomach lurched. The mound of earth was still there, but the cross was gone. In its place was a freshly dug hole. I stood there staring at the hole, numb with horror. I didn't know what to do. I ran back to the campsite and told Sarah what I had found. She collapsed, sobbing uncontrollably. We called the park rangers, who arrived a couple of hours later. They searched the area, bringing in dogs and a helicopter. They found nothing, no footprints, no clothing, no sign of Emily at all. They searched for days, widening the search area, but it was like she had vanished into thin air. The police questioned us, of course. They looked at us with suspicion, but they had no evidence of anything other than a missing child. Eventually, they gave up. The search was called off. Emily was never found. We went home, our family broken. The tent is still in the garage. I can't bring myself to look at it. I keep thinking about that scraping sound circling our tent in the middle of the night and the hole in the clearing where the cross used to be. I don't know what happened to Emily, and I don't think I ever will. All I know is that something took her, something out there in the woods, something evil. The trail was supposed to be a moderate day hike, something to clear my head after a stressful week at the office. My friend Mark had suggested it. He'd hiked it before and said the views were worth the climb. We set off from the trailhead early Saturday morning, the crisp autumn air filling our lungs. The woods were quiet, the only sounds our boots crunching on fallen leaves and the occasional call of a bird. About 4 hours in, we stumbled upon something odd. A campsite, a fully set-up campsite, deep in the middle of nowhere. There was a tent, a neatly rolled sleeping bag, and a fire pit with embers that were still radiating heat. But there was no one there. "That's weird," Mark said, stating the obvious. We called out, thinking maybe the camper had just wandered off to relieve themselves or find water. But silence was the only reply. We hung around for maybe an hour, debating what to do. Eventually, we decided whoever it was would probably be back soon. We didn't want to take up their spot, so we moved on, finding another clearing a short distance away to set up our own camp. As dusk settled, I couldn't shake the feeling of discomfort. The abandoned campsite played on my mind. Who leaves a perfectly good campsite unattended, and why? We made a fire, cooked some dinner, and tried to relax. The woods grew darker, and the sounds of the forest intensified. Every snap of a twig made me jump. Later, as we sat by the fire, a rustling sound drifted from the direction of the other campsite. It was distinct, not like an animal, more like something dragging across the forest floor. Mark and I exchanged glances. He picked up a large branch from the woodpile. We crept cautiously toward the other site. The moon provided just enough light to make out shapes. The tent was gone, vanished. The sleeping bag was still there, but the tent, the one thing providing shelter, had disappeared. We stood there for a long moment trying to process what we were seeing. Where could a tent even go? We searched the immediate area, thinking maybe it had been moved, but there was no sign of it. Back at our own campsite, the fire had burned down low. We added more wood, needing the reassurance of the flames. We sat in silence, listening. Then I began to notice the sound of footsteps. They were circling our tent, soft sounds in the fallen leaves, a presence slowly moving around the outside of our tent. The sounds circled and circled. I nudged Mark. He shot up and grabbed a log from the fire and moved to the other side of the tent. The footsteps continued their round and round. The campfire crackled, spitting sparks into the inky black sky. We were a group of 6, huddled around the flames in a clearing deep within the Redwood National Park. The usual camping trip fare, toasted marshmallows, slightly burnt hot dogs, and ghost stories meant to spook each other. The tales were predictable, the usual local legends and campfire cliches. Then it happened. A light, not just any light, but an intense, all-consuming brightness that obliterated everything. One moment we were laughing, the next we were blinded. The sound of the fire drowned out by a high-pitched whine that vibrated through my skull. I squeezed my eyes shut, hands flying up to shield my face, certain something awful was happening. Then, just as suddenly, it was gone. Silence descended, immediate and absolute. My vision swam as I blinked, trying to adjust to the darkness that now seemed deeper than before. The fire still burned, but its light seemed diminished. Struggling to push back the encroaching black, panic began to bubble as I realized there were only 5 of us. Mark was gone. One moment he was there, laughing about some ridiculous monster under the bed story. The next vanished. "Mark!" Someone called out, their voice trembling slightly. We scrambled to our feet, grabbing our torches and fanning out, calling his name into the void. The forest was silent, except for our increasingly frantic shouts and the crackling fire. We searched for what felt like hours, pushing through the undergrowth, our torches cutting weak swathes through the darkness. Nothing, not a sign, not a sound, nothing to explain where he had gone. Eventually, defeated and terrified, we decided to hike back to the park entrance and call the police. The ranger station was deserted, a single flickering light illuminating the empty desk. We used the phone to report Mark's disappearance, our voices shaking as we tried to explain the impossible. The police arrived quickly, sirens echoing through the quiet forest. They interviewed us, asking questions we couldn't answer, searching for explanations we didn't have. We told them about the light, the sudden silence, the vanished friend, but I saw the disbelief in their eyes. How could they believe us? We barely believed it ourselves. For days, the forest was swarming with search teams. Helicopters buzzed overhead, dogs barked, and volunteers combed the undergrowth. They found nothing. No trace of Mark, no evidence of foul play, no explanation for his disappearance. The case went cold. Another unsolved mystery lost within the vast wilderness of Redwood National Park. Weeks passed, the camping trip became a nightmare, a constant source of anxiety and bewilderment. I tried to push it to the back of my mind, to return to some semblance of normality, but the memory of that blinding light and the subsequent silence continued to haunt me. Then, one morning, I received a phone call. It was the police. They'd found him. Mark was alive. He'd been discovered walking down a highway miles from the park. He was disoriented, confused, and had absolutely no memory of what had happened after the campfire. He didn't remember the light, the search, or the missing weeks. He just remembered sitting around the fire and then waking up on a road. I visited him in the hospital. He was physically fine, but his eyes held a distant, vacant look that I didn't recognize. He kept repeating that he felt like he'd had a really bad dream, but couldn't recall what it was about. The doctors ran tests, but found nothing unusual. He was back, but he wasn't really back. I left the hospital. The image of his blank stare burned into my mind. The sun felt cold on my skin, and the world around me seemed subtly altered, tainted by something I couldn't name or understand. I looked up at the sky, searching for answers, but there were only clouds drifting slowly across the indifferent blue. The trail was narrow, barely more than a deer path, winding through the thickest part of the pine forest. Sunlight struggled to pierce the canopy, leaving the ground beneath in a perpetual twilight. I'd been hiking for hours, enjoying the solitude, the familiar scent of pine needles and damp earth filling my lungs. Then the silence came. It wasn't just a reduction in noise, it was an absence. The birds had stopped singing. The breeze that had rustled the needles overhead vanished. Even the insects, usually a constant drone in these woods, were gone. The quiet was absolute, complete. It pressed in on me, making the hairs on my neck prickle. Then I became aware of something behind me, a footstep. It was deep, resonant, like something large placing its foot on the forest floor. I sped up a little, hoping it was just another hiker, though I hadn't passed anyone all day. Another footstep, matching my increased pace. It wasn't an animal. The cadence was too steady, too measured. I began to walk rapidly. The footsteps did too. Panic clawed at my throat. I broke into a run, branches whipping at my face, my boots pounding against the packed earth. Behind me, the footsteps accelerated as well, growing into a terrifying thunder. The ground seemed to vibrate with each impact, the sound echoing through the silent trees. I pumped my arms, legs burning, lungs screaming for air. I could sense whatever was behind me gaining. The trees blurred into a green tunnel. I risked a glance over my shoulder, but there was nothing, only the trees rushing by. Ahead, I could see a break in the trees, a clearing bathed in weak sunlight. I pushed harder, driven by desperate hope. I burst into the open space, stumbling, almost falling, and then the sound vanished. The earth stopped shaking, the thunder ceased. The silence returned, just as complete as before. I spun around, scanning the edge of the forest. The trees stood motionless, except for the tops of the pines, which swayed gently, as if something huge had just pushed its way through. I stood there, gasping, heart hammering against my ribs. The forest stared back, silent, indifferent. The plan was simple. A weekend camping trip with my son Billy in the Redwood National Park. Just the two of us, escaping the city noise for some fresh air and father-son bonding. We arrived Friday afternoon, the trees towering over us, sunlight barely managing to pierce the canopy. Saturday began peacefully. We hiked a short trail, enjoying the quiet. Then we paused near a ravine to catch our breath. That's when the screaming began. A deep, loud roar tore through the forest. It echoed off the trees. I remember freezing, a cold wave washing over me. Billy grabbed my arm, his eyes wide. "What was that, Dad?" I tried to sound casual. "Probably just a mountain lion, or maybe Bigfoot decided to say hello." I chuckled, but the sound felt forced, even to my own ears. The scream had been too deep, too resonant to be any animal I knew. It left an unpleasant sensation in my stomach. We continued our hike, but the atmosphere had shifted. The forest silence now seemed strained, expectant. Every rustle of leaves, every bird call made me jump. Later, we reached our campsite. We set up the tent, gathered firewood, and started preparing dinner. As dusk arrived, the forest grew darker, the trees morphing into indistinct shapes. While I stirred a pot of beans, I then noticed the twigs snapping in the perimeter of the campsite. It was subtle but constant, like something large was walking just beyond the edge of the light cast by our campfire. I glanced at Billy, who was poking at the fire with a stick. He hadn't seemed to notice anything. Still, I decided it was best to turn in. "All right, buddy," I said. "Time for bed. We can finish dinner tomorrow." We zipped up the tent, the nylon a thin barrier between us and the night. I lay awake for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest. The snapping continued intermittently, now accompanied by the distant hooting of an owl. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off to sleep. I woke up to silence, a different kind of silence than the expectant quiet of the forest. The still was absolute. I reached for Billy, but his sleeping bag was empty. Panic gripped me. "Billy," I whispered, my voice trembling. I fumbled for the tent zipper, pulled it down, and crawled outside. The campsite was empty. The fire had died down to embers, and then I noticed them. Massive footprints in the soft earth surrounding the tent. Footprints far too large to be human, with a strange splayed shape. My gaze followed the tracks to the nearest tree, where I detected clumps of dark fur snagged on the branches. Our backpacks lay ripped open, their contents scattered across the ground. Billy's favorite teddy bear was torn in half. I stood there, frozen, the blood draining from my face. The forest loomed around me, silent, indifferent. The morning air was crisp, cold. I was alone. The drive up to the mountains was longer than I remembered. By the time we found a decent spot to pitch our tents, the sun was already beginning to dip below the peaks. Liam and Sarah were already bickering about where the cooking equipment should go as I wrestled with the tent poles. We finally got everything set up as dusk settled. The air nipped at my skin, so we gathered firewood. Soon a decent blaze was crackling merrily, chasing away the encroaching darkness and the chill. We arranged our camping chairs around the circle of light, the flames casting dancing patterns on the surrounding trees. I poured myself a cup of instant coffee. It tasted like dirt, but the warmth was welcome. As we sat there, enjoying the quiet, I registered a distinct sound from the woods beyond our campsite. Branches snapped. Not the little twigs that break under a squirrel's feet, but larger, more substantial branches, the kind that would require some force to break. The sound travelled far in the still mountain air. Liam must have registered it too. He paused mid-sentence, his brow furrowing. He picked up the most powerful torch we had, a rechargeable one with a beam like a spotlight. He flicked it on, the sudden blaze of light cutting through the trees. For the barest fraction of a second, I could have sworn I discerned something large standing between the trees. A dark shape, far bigger than any animal I knew inhabited these woods, a figure of significant size. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it vanished. Liam swept the beam back and forth, illuminating the trees and undergrowth. "Probably just a deer," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Sarah, who usually had a sarcastic comment for everything, was silent, her eyes wide. I took another sip of my coffee, trying to dismiss what I thought I had glimpsed. It was probably just my imagination, fueled by too many horror movies and not enough sleep. A few minutes passed, the only sound the crackling fire and the gentle rush of wind through the trees. Then it happened. A deafening crash echoed through the campsite. We all jumped, our hearts hammering against our ribs. Right where our fire was situated, a giant rock had landed. It must have been dropped from above because it was far too big for anyone to just throw it. It had landed just inches from the edge of the fire pit, scattering embers and sending sparks flying into the air. Panic flared. Liam scrambled to his feet, grabbing the torch again. He swept it around, the beam frantic. Nothing. Just trees. "What the hell was that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Nobody had an answer. We stood there, frozen, staring at the rock. It was easily the size of a small television, far too large to have simply fallen. Someone, or something, had to have put it there. The atmosphere shifted. The peaceful quiet of the mountains had gone, replaced by a sense of dreadful anticipation. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I scanned the tree line, my eyes straining in the darkness. Liam insisted that we put the fire out. He was right. It was a beacon, advertising our presence to whatever was out there. We doused the flames with water, the hissing steam momentarily obscuring our vision. Now in total darkness, except for the beam of Liam's torch, we huddled together. The temperature seemed to have dropped, and the sounds of the forest seemed louder, more menacing. We decided to get in the car. It felt like the only safe place. Liam fumbled with the keys, and we scrambled inside, locking the doors. He started the engine, the sudden roar shattering the silence. As headlights illuminated the track ahead, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Something made me look. Standing at the edge of the woods, just beyond the reach of the light, was a shape, tall and dark, impossibly tall. It was completely still. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. I just stared, my breath catching in my throat. Liam put the car in gear and we started to drive. I looked into the rearview mirror to see if the figure had moved, but it was no longer there. We drove in silence. Nobody spoke for at least an hour. Sarah was asleep in the back seat, but I couldn't sleep. I was too on edge. I kept thinking about what I had seen. I knew that whatever it was still out there. We drove all night, not stopping until we reached a proper town. We got a motel room, had a shower, and tried to get some sleep. Liam and Sarah told me I was probably just imagining things, that I was tired and stressed. But I knew what I'd seen. I haven't been camping since. The drive up to the campsite had been uneventful. Just me, Liam, Sarah and Ben crammed into my old Jeep, singing along to the radio. We were all looking forward to a weekend away from the city, a chance to breathe some fresh air, and maybe even see some stars. We arrived late afternoon, the sun already dipping behind the trees. The campsite was exactly as we'd remembered from the photos online, a small clearing surrounded by towering pines with a fire pit and a picnic table. We quickly set about pitching our tents and gathering firewood, the usual camping routine. As dusk settled, we lit a fire and started cooking dinner. It was then that I began to notice something wasn't quite right. The forest had gone quiet, eerily so. Usually, even as night falls, there's a constant buzz of crickets, the rustling of leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl. But tonight there was nothing, just silence, complete and utter silence. I glanced at the others, but they seemed oblivious, chatting and laughing as they ate. I didn't want to spoil the mood, so I kept my concerns to myself. Perhaps the animals were just having a quiet night. After dinner, we sat around the fire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. The silence of the forest continued to bother me, but I tried to ignore it, focusing on the flickering flames and the sound of my friends' voices. Liam was mid-sentence when I noticed it, a dark shape high up in the branches of one of the taller trees. At glance, I assumed it was a bird's nest or some strange growth on the tree, but then it shifted. Ever so slightly, I could see it had mass. My heart began to pound. I stared, transfixed, as the shape slowly detached itself from the branch and moved to another. It was something huge, something solid. It was hard to make out details in the dim light, but I could tell it was vaguely humanoid, with long, spindly limbs. It moved with an unnatural grace, its limbs bending and contorting as it lapped from branch to branch. I wanted to scream, to warn the others, but my throat was dry. My voice caught somewhere between my lungs and my lips. The thing was getting ever so near the edge of the tree line. I saw its form quite clearly as it prepared to set foot to the ground. It held on to the thick branch before letting go. It landed with a thud. Not a loud thud, but a startling one, and then there was the sound it made, a piercing sound, a scream that snapped me out of my frozen state. "Run!" I yelled, my voice hoarse. I didn't wait to see if the others followed. I spun around and sprinted in the opposite direction, away from the campsite, away from the thing in the trees. I plunged into the darkness of the forest, branches whipping at my face, roots snagging at my feet. I could hear the others behind me, their panicked footsteps echoing through the trees. But then the footsteps faded, replaced by the sound of something else. Something gaining on me. I risked a glance over my shoulder. The thing was there, loping through the trees with incredible speed. It was much bigger than I had initially thought, easily 7 or 8 feet tall. Its eyes glowed with an eerie light, and its mouth was open in a silent scream. It was hunting me. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning, my legs aching. I dodged trees and leaped over fallen logs, desperately trying to put distance between myself and the thing pursuing me. I could hear it behind me, its footsteps growing asterisk, the snapping of branches as it crashed through the undergrowth. I knew I couldn't outrun it forever. I stumbled upon a small stream and splashed through it, hoping to throw the thing off my trail. But it didn't seem to matter. It was still coming, its presence growing stronger with each passing second. I scrambled up the bank on the other side of the stream and kept running, blindly pushing forward, not knowing where I was going, only knowing that I had to get away. The forest grew denser, the trees closing in around me. The air was cold and damp, and the silence had returned, even more profound than before. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. I tripped over a root and fell heavily to the ground, my breath knocked out of me. I lay there for a moment, gasping for air, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. I knew I couldn't stay down for long. The thing was still out there, hunting me. I forced myself to my feet and started running again, even though every muscle in my body screamed in protest. As I ran, I began to notice something different about the trees. They were getting taller, their branches reaching up towards the sky like skeletal fingers, and the ground beneath my feet was becoming softer, almost spongy. I realized I was entering a swamp. The water was cold and murky, and the ground was unstable. I sank up to my ankles with every step, the mud sucking at my shoes. It made progress difficult, but I pressed on, hoping that the swamp would provide some kind of barrier between me and the thing that was chasing me. But then I heard it, the sound of something large moving through the water. I stopped and turned around, my heart pounding in my chest. The thing was there, standing at the edge of the swamp, its eyes glowing in the darkness. It took a step into the water and then another. It didn't seem to be affected by the mud or the water. It moved with the same unnatural ease, closing the distance between us. I knew I couldn't outrun it in the swamp. I was trapped. I stood there, frozen in fear as the thing continued to approach. I could see it more clearly now. Its skin was pale and stretched taut over its bones. Its teeth were long and pointed, and its claws were sharp and curved. It was almost upon me, and then everything went black. The map was useless. I knew I shouldn't have veered off the marked trail, but the woods looked so much more interesting further in. Now, hours later, the sun was beginning to dip below the trees, painting long, distorted shapes on the forest floor, and I was hopelessly lost somewhere in the Pennsylvania wilderness. I pushed through a particularly dense patch of brush, annoyed. The branches snagged at my clothes, and I muttered under my breath about trusting online trail reviews. That's when I almost tripped. Hidden behind the wall of green was an opening, not a natural one. The earth seemed to have been disturbed, and the foliage was bent back in a way that suggested something had passed through here repeatedly. Curiosity, that constant companion of bad decisions, got the better of me. I pushed aside the last of the branches and found myself staring at the mouth of a cave. It wasn't a grand, gaping maw, but a narrow, almost secretive entrance leading into the darkness. I hesitated. I had a flashlight in my backpack, but common sense screamed at me to turn around and try to find the trail before night fell completely. But the lure of the unknown was too powerful. I pulled out my flashlight. The beam cut through the blackness, revealing a low, claustrophobic passage. The air inside was cool and damp and carried a scent of earth and something else, something acrid and vaguely unpleasant. I stepped inside, my boots crunching on loose stones. The passage opened up into a small chamber. The light danced across the walls, revealing glistening minerals and strange formations, and then I noticed them. Bones. Scattered across the floor were bones of various sizes, animal bones, mostly I assumed. Deer, squirrels, maybe a fox, but then my light fell on something that made my stomach clench. A skull. Not an animal skull, a human skull, and then another and another. They were clean, picked utterly bare. The bone was almost polished, gleaming faintly in the flashlight beam. A cold dread seeped into me. This wasn't a natural cave. This was something else entirely. Panic welled up in my chest, urging me to flee. I turned to leave, desperate to put as much distance as possible between myself and this horrifying place. That's when I perceived it. A sound. Deep within the cave, from the deepest part of the darkness, came a series of clicks. Not the sound of rocks falling, not the sound of water dripping. Something far more sinister. They were rapid and sharp, like bone on bone. My blood ran cold. I froze, my hand still on the damp rock of the cave wall. The clicking continued, growing more rapid, more urgent. It was coming closer. Terror lent me speed I didn't know I possessed. I swung the flashlight back towards the source of the sound. The beam landed on something that defied description, something huge and gaunt, with eyes that reflected the light like burning coals. It was charging. A scream ripped from its throat, a sound that was primal and utterly terrifying. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and ran. I scrambled out of the cave, heedless of the branches that tore at my skin. I didn't stop running until I was well into the trees, my lungs burning, my heart hammering against my ribs. I threw myself behind a thick bush, gasping for breath, trying to control my ragged breathing. I risked a peek back towards the cave. The shape burst from the entrance, silhouetted against the fading light. It paused for a moment, its head cocked as if trying to locate me. Then with another ear-splitting shriek it ran past my hiding place, disappearing into the woods. I waited, trembling until the sound of its passage faded into the distance. Only then did I dare to move. I stumbled to my feet and started to run again, blindly, desperately, trying to find my way back to the trail, back to my car, back to civilization. The forest seemed to press in on me, the trees twisting into grotesque shapes in the dwindling light. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the undergrowth sent a jolt of terror through me. I forced myself to keep moving, driven by pure adrenaline. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw it, a familiar marker, a blaze of white paint on a tree trunk, the trail. I lurched towards it, relief flooding through me. I was safe. I was going to be okay. I started running down the trail towards where I parked the car. I was almost there. The car was in sight. Then I perceived it behind me, the clicking. The plan was simple, a weekend camping trip in the Appalachians, me and Dave escaping the city for some fresh air. We found a secluded spot a few miles from the trailhead, pitched the tent, and spent the afternoon gathering firewood. The evening was peaceful. We ate our dehydrated meals, told stories, and watched the stars appear. The night was quiet until it wasn't. A child's cry pierced the darkness. It was faint, distant, but unmistakable. I nudged Dave awake. He mumbled something incoherent, then sat up listening. The crying persisted, a sorrowful sound that seemed to carry on the wind. We grabbed our flashlights and unzipped the tent. The beam cut through the blackness, revealing only trees and underbrush. We crept a few feet away from the tent, calling out, but there was no response, only the continued weeping. After half an hour of searching, we returned to the tent, puzzled and disturbed. The crying faded eventually, and we managed to fall asleep. The next day, we hiked a nearby trail, trying to shake off the previous night's experience. We speculated about what we heard, maybe a lost child or some kind of animal mimicking a human sound. We didn't find any evidence of either. That night, the crying returned. It was the same as before, a child's desperate wail cutting through the stillness. It was more intense, like the child was nearer. Again, we searched, our flashlights dancing across the trees, but found nothing. We were becoming increasingly unsettled. There was something deeply disturbing about the sound, the way it seemed to echo through the mountains. On the third day, we were both on edge. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made us jump. We debated packing up and leaving, but we were stubborn and didn't want to admit defeat. As darkness descended, a sense of dread settled over the campsite. We sat inside the tent, barely speaking, as the crying began again. This time it was different. It was so close it sounded like the child was right outside the tent. The sound was heartrending. Dave couldn't take it anymore. "I'm going to find out what that is," he said, his voice tight with a strange determination. I tried to stop him, but he was already unzipping the tent. He stepped out into the darkness, flashlight in hand. I watched as the beam of light moved through the trees, then disappeared over a small ridge, maybe 15 feet distant, and then silence. I waited, expecting to hear him call out, but there was nothing. Just the faint sound of the wind in the trees. Panic started to set in. "Dave!" I yelled, my voice trembling. No response. I grabbed my flashlight and stumbled out of the tent. The ridge was right there. I scrambled to the top and shined the light down the other side. Nothing. Just more trees, more darkness. Dave was gone. I called out his name again and again, my voice cracking with fear. There was no answer, only the echo of my own voice bouncing back at me. I stumbled around in the undergrowth, my flashlight beam searching for any sign of him, any clue as to where he'd gone, but there was nothing. It was as if he had simply vanished. I didn't know what to do. I was alone, miles from civilization, and my friend was missing. I couldn't stay there. I scrambled back to the tent, packed everything as quickly as I could, and started running towards the trailhead. The forest seemed to close in around me. Every shadow seemed to hide something sinister. Every sound sent shivers down my spine. I ran blindly, driven by a primal fear. I was almost at the trailhead when I heard it. A voice, Dave's voice, screaming my name. It was calling and begging me to come back. The voice was filled with pain, terror, and something else, something I couldn't identify, but which made my blood run cold. It was so loud now and very distinct. I stopped, frozen. I wanted to run back to help him, but something held me back. The sound of his voice. It sounded strange. Like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere. I turned and ran, ignoring the screams, ignoring the pleas. I didn't stop running until I reached my car and sped away from those mountains. The alarm went off at 4 a.m. I fumbled for it in the dark, feeling around the bedside table until my fingers found the snooze button. Hunting season had just begun, and I wasn't about to miss opening day, even if it meant dragging myself out of bed before sunrise. I pulled on my hunting gear, the worn camouflage jacket, the sturdy boots I'd had for years, and headed out into the pre-dawn darkness. The air was cold and damp, fog hung low, swirling around my ankles like a ghostly stream. I trudged through it, the beam of my headlamp cutting a narrow path. The woods were silent except for the crunch of my boots on the fallen leaves and the sound of my own breathing. The fog seemed to absorb all other noise, creating a strange, isolating effect. I kept moving, deeper into the forest, hoping to find a good spot before the sun fully rose. Then I heard it. A branch snapped behind me. My heart jumped into my throat. I spun around, my rifle instinctively rising in my hands. The fog made it hard to see anything beyond a few feet, but I definitely something large shift through the mist. It was immense. I couldn't make out any details, just a dark shape. It seemed too big to be a deer or even a bear. A wave of nausea washed over me. The smell was repulsive, like something decaying. It stung my nostrils and made my eyes water. I gripped my rifle tighter, my knuckles white. I tried to focus, to get a proper look at what was there, but the fog swirled and shifted, obscuring everything. Before I could bring myself to fire, the shape disappeared. One moment it was there, a massive presence in the fog, and the next it was gone, as if it had simply dissolved into the mist. The stench remained, though, clinging to the air, a foul reminder of what I had just witnessed. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my rifle raised, my senses on high alert. But there was nothing, no sound, no further sight, just the fog and that awful smell. Eventually I lowered my rifle, my arm starting to ache. I decided I didn't want to hunt anymore. The woods suddenly felt menacing, the fog no longer just an atmospheric phenomenon, but something sinister. I turned and made my way back to the cabin, my pace quicker than before. I reached the cabin just as the sun was beginning to fully rise, painting the fog with streaks of orange and gold. I unlocked the door and went inside, locking it firmly behind me. I sat by the window, rifle across my lap, watching the woods. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was still out there. The day passed slowly. I busied myself with chores, trying to distract myself from what I had on the forest, but the image of that shape and that stench kept replaying in my mind. As darkness fell, the woods outside seemed to deepen. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I made sure all the windows and doors were locked. I double-checked the lock on the front door, then wedged a chair under the door handle for good measure. I sat in the living room with the light on, my rifle resting beside me. It was late, and I found it hard to keep my eyes open. Just as I was about to give in and head to bed, I heard it, a sound outside. I froze, listening intently. Heavy breaths, long, labored, rasping breaths just outside the door. My blood ran cold. I grabbed my rifle, my hands shaking. The breathing continued, a constant, dreadful sound that filled the small cabin. Then there was a pause, a moment of absolute silence. Then the door splintered open. A huge, hairy form burst into the cabin, filling the doorway. It screamed, a high, terrible sound of rage and hate.